All right, good evening. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
All right, great. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our monthly webinar from the Southeastern PA Cold War Historical Society. My name is Eleanor Rangers, and I'm the president of the organization. And as usual, I have a couple of preliminary announcements, and then we'll turn things over to our guest speaker this evening. I will request at the conclusion of my remarks, if you could kindly mute your microphones and turn off your cameras. That can preserve bandwidth and minimize sound so that we can focus our attention on David's presentation. So I do appreciate that. And as always, this is our History in Our Backyard webinar series. This actually started as a live program in 2012 and continues as a webinar series today. We're hoping, provided COVID calms down, that we'll be able to perhaps reinitiate some limited live programming in the Warminster area in the near future. But for now, we continue to offer these webinars on a monthly basis. I also wanted to mention that there is a new offering that's going to be available at the Johnsville Centrifuge. Grand opening actually next weekend, April 22nd, 23rd, is a brewery and pub called Tranquility Brewing Company, and they will be actually brewing their own craft beer and having, pub fare that you can purchase there as well. And I believe they will periodically have live music. So it will be one of the only microbreweries in the local area. So you'll definitely have to check it out. Actually, again, at the site of the old Johnsville Centrifuge, where astronauts and pilots trained to basically familiarize themselves with high acceleration in their spacecraft or high performance aircraft. Also, for those of you online who may have been affiliated with the Old Naval Air Development Center, where the Johnsville Centrifuge was located, actually, I am in the process of working with some other members, former alumni from the naval base, to have an open house and sort of informal reunion in August. And this will be at the Centrifuge, probably basically affiliated with the brew pub, actually. But this is basically opened up to any former employees of the naval base, as well as contractors that may have worked there, and families are also welcome. Hopefully, we will be able to also offer some limited tours of the facility as well during that event. So we're just in the process of organizing that. So there will be more details coming out, but I did want to give a heads up. And also just, had to make the little bit of a request. We are a nonprofit organization, and we certainly, like to be able to support events like this with having guest lecturers from out of town. So donations are always welcome, to the organization. All of the donations go strictly to the execution of guest lecture, honoraria, some display work that, we're actually just starting to work on some new things, maintenance of our website, and transcription of interviews, which has been a long-term thing on my bucket list. But just some examples of things that go straight to the organization. So we do appreciate the generosity if you so choose. Also, just as a reminder, again, if you would like to get on our email distribution list, I do send out a couple of announcements starting about 2 weeks before our webinar events, just to make people aware. And if you would like to get on that list, send us an email at mail@coldwarhistory.org, and we'd be happy to get you on that list. We also do maintain a YouTube channel and a Facebook page. So the Facebook page is an alternate way in which you can connect with our organization. And I do post the Zoom link for these webinars there as well. And on our webpage, on our events page on the website, we also post the information there as well. Wanted to make an announcement as well. Next month's lecture was originally going to be a live event, but our speaker is unable to come out from Dayton. Actually, he's a docent at the Air Force Museum. So we're going to be doing it as a webinar. But looking forward to this one as well. John Shell, who I also had a chance to meet last summer when I was out at the Air Force Museum, has been doing some interesting research on the U2 incident and has some new information about that whole event that I think is really fascinating. I've seen a preview of the presentation. I think you guys will really enjoy it. So definitely would encourage you to attend our webinar next month. And again, just a reminder to please mute your microphones and turn off your cameras for the presentation. I'll be doing the same momentarily. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our guest speaker this evening. And this is actually a three-peat. David has actually delivered, well, soon to be 3 lectures on the on various missiles in our former or current armamentarium, nuclear armamentarium. And this evening, we'll be talking about the third of these missile programs. But David is a retired plant biochemist living in Tucson, and he's written 3 histories on the Minuteman, the Titan II, and Regulus missile, which we'll be hearing about this evening. And he also volunteered at the Titan Missile Museum out in near Tucson as a historian and tour guide for 15 years. And he was instrumental in the effort to gain National Historic Monument status for that museum. Also, just to put a little shameless plug in on David's behalf, the Regulus book, which was the first of the books that he actually published, is available on Amazon. I just checked it before this talk this evening. It is available in hard copy and Kindle versions. You'll see the image on the left if you look this up on Amazon. But there is another alternate image that I have seen in some other venues as well. But it is one and the same book. So with that, I am going to turn things over to David. So we're going to do a quick switch of screens and we will go from there. So David, I will let you share your screen, and again, make sure to click on that little box in the lower left-hand corner of the share screen so we'll be able to hear the sound.
Okay, are we sharing screen now?
You are sharing your screen. We're good to go.
Okay. Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak again to this group. The title of the talk is Regulus, the Forgotten Weapon, and we're going to find out why as we go through. There's one disclaimer. I recently was diagnosed with cortical basal degeneration, which is a neurological disease. So if my voice disappears or things get a little squirrely, it's not your screen, it's me. Okay, so we're going to have an overview. Let's get this thing working here, David. An overview of the talk. We're going to put Regulus into context and then go back into the history with how the Navy got into guided missiles really briefly. Then Regulus 1 development, which was where we spend most of the time. Regulus 1 deployment, which I'll make the case that it shouldn't have been a forgotten weapon. Regulus 2 development. So 2 unique photographs I want to share, and then a summary slide. So Regulus 1 in context. It was overshadowed by Polaris, quite reasonably. Regulus had very few missiles per submarine compared to the 16 per Polaris boat. But the Regulus program began in 1951. Polaris program began in 1956. So there's a 5-year period where Regulus was the weapon of choice for submarine and carrier and cruiser deployment. 24 ships were converted for use with Regulus 1. That's not well known. 10 submarines, of which 5 were guidance only, 4 heavy cruisers, which each deployed with Regulus 1, and 10 aircraft carriers. It was actually deployed to Westpac and also to the Mediterranean on 2 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, and 5 submarines. So it was quite an extensive program for the Navy, even if it's not very well known. So the Navy and guided missiles. In the closing months of World War II, guided missile technology blossomed as the technological breakthrough for the delivery of offensive weapons. The German V-1 buzz bomb cruise missile proved to be crude, but potentially devastating weapon. It had no guidance. It was launched on an azimuth, and after a little turbine in the nose reached a certain number of turns or a given range, it dived into the ground. So there was really no guidance per se. Even more frightening was the technologically advanced V-2 ballistic missile. This is the end of one era and into another. The struggle within the United States Armed Forces for supremacy in the delivery of strategic as well as tactical nuclear weapons was waged primarily between Navy and the Air Force. There were, between 1947 and 1953, there was the field of guided missile technology grew at a tremendous pace with over 114 separate missile weapon systems contracted as development projects during this period. At the end of the Korean War in 1953, the list had been pared down considerably, with only 25 guided missile programs actually reaching flight hardware stage. The Navy had one in the game at that point, the surface-to-surface program, Champsfott's Regulus missile. So how did the Navy get into this? Project Derby from 1945 to 1949. That was training Navy personnel on the operation of the Northrop LTV N-2 Loon, the Americanized version of the V-1. First successful submarine launch took place on 12 April 1946, so very shortly after the war. USS Cusk had a container to house the missile, the hangar. The Carbonero could launch missiles. Then here's a clip from
them had been perfected. The USS Cusk, a World War II diesel submarine, was modified to launch the Loon. On March 7, 1947, the Cusk cruised out to sea for its first missile launch. At 1100 hours, Captain Fred Berry pressed the fire button. The radar control team aboard the Cusk then guided the Loon to target. The test had been a resounding success. The Cusk became the Navy's first guided missile submarine.
So that was the Loon, demonstrating the Loon was submarine-launched missiles was feasible. So then they went to Project Pounce. Project Pounce was to evaluate the operational capabilities of the Loon missile. How could we actually use it as an offensive weapon? This culminated in Operation Mickey, November 1949. This was conducted in the Hawaiian Islands fleet operating areas, and two submarines, the Cusk and the Carbonero, deployed from Port Hueneme, California, under simulated wartime conditions, accompanied by the submarine tender USS Sperry, which carried 4 Loon missiles. The first launch by Cusk was successful, but the missile splashed about 20 nautical miles downrange. Carbonero launched a second Loon that flew untouched over the fleet as they tried to shoot it down with anti-aircraft fire. With these attempts unsuccessful, aircraft were launched and directed to shoot the missile down as it cruised at 10,000 feet and 300 knots. The missile was not shot down, finally splashing into the ocean due to fuel exhaustion. So this demonstrated to the Navy, and the Surface Navy and the Aviation Navy, that the guided missiles had a place in the Navy armament. So from there, with Regulus already been contracted, which we'll get to in a minute, the submarine force went on and generated something called Project Trounce from 1950 to 53. This is formed within the Project Derby to train submarine personnel with the new Trounce pulse radar guidance system, which we'll also discuss in just a little bit. Since Regulus wasn't ready yet when they started this, they used drone aircraft and moon missiles to develop the system for Regulus. So Regulus actually began in 17 November 1947, where Chance Vought received a letter of intent to develop one flight test vehicle. One reason they got the letter was because, as you'll see in a minute, the missile could be recovered and flown repeatedly. On 20 September 48, so approximately a year later, they received a contract for 30 flight test vehicles. This is a 1/4 scale wind tunnel model of the Regulus One. You'll note that there's a dorsal fin and a fin underneath, and I guess that'd be a ventral fin. The ventral fin was thought to be necessary for the terminal dive to target, but it was soon discovered they didn't need it, so they removed it, greatly simplifying surface launch. These are the general arrangement particulars for the missile, and I'm going to see if I can get my cursor to go over there. Can you see a cursor?
Yes, now we can.
Okay. So the air intake's right here. And it was a plenum air intake, and the air passed through over all this equipment, all the way to the intake of the J-33 engine down here. That was a rather unique design. The wings were made of a material called metallite, which was balsa wood covered with balsa wood honeycomb covered with aluminum. 2 JATO booster rockets were on either side, and this allowed them to launch from a zero launch type system, but was quite a headache for many tests because you had to get them perfectly aligned, which we'll discuss in just a minute. On cursor. So how big was Regulus One? It was basically the size of a very small jet airplane, 32 feet long, and stood at a height of about 8 feet, 8 inches, 8.8 feet. It came in several varieties. There was a flight test vehicle, which is what Chance Vought used at Edwards Air Force Base. That same style vehicle was converted into what they called the Fleet Training Missile. And then there was also the KDU, a target drone that was used. As I said, the unique feature was the recoverability. So it had a tricycle landing gear and could be landed via remote control. Unlike the Matador, Air Force's Matador, which could not be recovered. And this is one of the many features the Navy really liked. More than one missile flew more than once, and the record that I could find was 20 recovered flights. So you can imagine the savings not having to build that many fleet training missiles. This is FTV-1 on the ready for low speed taxi test in 10 March 1950. So when I found this picture, I just couldn't help but laugh. This is the state of the art at the time. They needed to do low speed taxi tests. So they towed the missile behind this truck. Behind the truck to the left is the TV-2D Shooting Star director and chase plane. This is pretty low tech. And what I'm going to show you next shows you just how low tech it was. You can see on the wing there, it's a figure with a flight helmet on. That's Roy Pearson, the chief test pilot. On the other side is I. Nevin Pally, the director of guided missiles for Chance Vought. And the low speed taxi test, this is the only piloted one because Roy Pearson had control over the differential braking. They wanted to see if the aircraft could director aircraft could do the directing and as it was being towed, and the radio on the director aircraft pooped out. So they needed some way to slow the missile down. So Roy steered it to a stop. He recalls that as clear as day when I interviewed him 1994. They wouldn't even begin to allow that nowadays. So Regulus guidance systems, as I said, Loon was an interesting missile, but it, I mean, the V1, but it didn't have any control guidance capability. It just was launched on an azimuth. So the Loon differed. They had a radio command control system for Loon, which was adopted for Regulus. Regulus had several different ways of chasing the aircraft and guiding it. The TV-2D and the TV-1 was one pair. Fox 1 and 2 was the ground equivalent. And out of sight controller was the third. We'll discuss each one of those separately. Then there was trounce pulsed radar. All the radio command and control and trounce pulsed radar were all used in the operational system. This is a typical landing operation, or it could be taking off. I wasn't sure which one. You see the TV2, the TV2D on the left and the TV-1 on the right. I'm not a pilot, but I still think it's pretty amazing at 300 miles per hour landing speed. These jets are flying maybe 30 feet off the ground. That just really impresses me. So TV-2D is on the left, TV-1 is on the right. The TV-1 pilot position was known as its Charlie position. During initial flight testing, this aircraft could serve as both a missile surrogate or a backup control aircraft. In the surrogate missile function, the Charlie pilot was basically along for the ride, as the able pilot in the TV-2, which we'll talk about in just a second, controlled the TV-1, including landing maneuvers right up to the point of touchdown. So this is the front cockpit of the TV-2D. The two positions were known as able and Baker. The able position was in the front, and the Baker position was in the back. The able position was where the pilot actually controlled the missile. They didn't look at the missile itself. They looked straight ahead as the aircraft was being flown by the Baker pilot and flown in conjunction with the missile. So by looking straight ahead, the able pilot was basically seeing what the missile was doing. The real trick was to not keep looking over at the missile. The Baker pilot flew in tight formation and with whatever maneuvers the drone or missile executed through command control by able. Thus the perception was the able pilot was as if he was in the drone or missile, since his commands were immediately reflected by changes in the flight path due to the Baker pilot. So whether they were flying alongside a missile or the TV-1, the same thing occurred. I talked to the training pilots, the pilots that trained to do this back when I wrote the book, and they said considerable training was required to ensure the able refrain from turning and watching the missile or drone too often or for too long. The Fox control station was the ground equivalent of the radio control, and that Fox position tested the missile before launch to make sure all the functions were working properly. And then when he turned his set off, the chase plane would fly over and verify that the commands were being signaled from the aircraft. This was what was called the out of sight control station. This was used on a Kusk submarine and was basically in conjunction with a plotting board, as you can see on the left. This was used to guide the aircraft for a submarine launch, to guide the missile for submarine launch. What they did to make sure there was transfer of control was oil was injected into the exhaust of the missile and generated a white plume of smoke. And they knew if that plume of smoke occurred, there was no control of the missile. They hadn't handed it off. So what they did was Cusk would be controlling up until landing. And they'd say 3, 2, 1, turnover control. And the TV-2D would take over. And if they didn't take over successfully, they'd see this pulse of smoke. So this is a really spectacular film. Now you have to realize they kind of spliced some pieces together on this film, but it's the intent is there.
They would attempt to jump 3 major hurdles: to get the missile airborne, to fly it under radio control, and bring it back for a safe landing.
We gotta stop for a minute and mention something. They did taxi tests for 8 months using Regulus 1, FTV-1, which ended up catching up with them, as we'll see now when I start this again. Whoops. Let's try going back one more slide. There we go.
They would attempt to jump 3 major hurdles: to get the missile airborne, to fly it under radio control, and bring it back for a safe landing. A TV-2D piloted by C.O. Miller, with Roy Pearson seated at the remote controls, circled the lake bed. At 8:09 a.m., Pearson took control of the missile and slowly increased the throttle to full power. At 190 knots, the missile gently rose from the lake bed.
I was flying on the right wing of the missile. The missile took off on the runway uneventfully, but got not too many hundreds of feet in the air, and all of a sudden it rolled. It went out of control and crashed. And my last vision was the missile passing underneath my airplane. It was a kick in the teeth.
What had happened was over the course of that 8-month period, a pin in one of the hydraulic pumps was made of brass and actually sheared, and that caused a loss of control. But the Navy didn't take anything for excuses. And so there was a fear that because this is the first actual launch airborne flight and it failed, that they might cancel the program right there. So Chancellor did a bold thing. They said to the Navy, we're going to have a formalized program of exhaustive reliability runs. The ground crew would carry out 20 completely successful simulated missions before the missile could be designated as flight qualified. So what they did is they made what was called the Weber-Dolly flight simulation runs. If you notice, the wheels aren't touching the hangar floor here on this dolly. So what they could do is go through all the radio commands and make sure the missile responded to the commands with landing gear coming up and retracting and deploying, the ailerons and everything working properly. They didn't run out the engine in here, obviously, because they're in the hangar. But I found that to be a really unique way of solving the problem of reliability. So I don't have film of the first actual successful flight of FTV-2, but we do have FTV-3.
It's later that Nevin Pelly felt confident enough to risk another flight. Early in the morning, the test team assembled on the lake bed to begin the test that would likely make or break the entire program. C.O. Miller flew his aircraft into position, and Roy Pearson took control of the missile. The Regulus lifted gracefully into the morning air. This time, the missile responded flawlessly, performing a series of wide turns and smoothly climbing to nearly 2,500 feet.
And the performance of the Regulus missile, from a flyability standpoint, was at least as good as any of the airplanes that were flying in those days. It was a very responsive machine.
The flight so far was a complete success, but the most dangerous task lay ahead: landing the missile under remote control. Flying just a dozen feet from the missile's wingtip, Miller and Pearson brought the missile and their aircraft down towards the lake bed at a blistering 200 knots. At this speed and altitude, there was no room for error. As Miller held the jet steady, Pearson expertly brought the missile down for a perfect landing.
As you see the missile slow down considerably, that's where Fox 2 came into play, because Fox 2 then used radio commands to guide the missile to steer down the runway correctly. They were forced to use the south base at Edwards Air Force Base because the Air Force didn't want any damage to the lake bed if there were any crashes, the north base lake bed. So there was one other guidance system I was going to talk about. That's the transpulsed radar. Transmission of paired pulse radar signals was the key to trounce. There is the need for reception and decoding by the guidance system on the missile. There were time delays of 0.15 to 0.2 to 0.25 seconds. This is all really high tech back then. This hadn't been done before with radar. They needed a radar set on the vessel, so the search, I think it was a search, maybe it's the aircraft radar, aerial aviation radar, air search radar, SV-1, was modified to scan only 10 to 20 degrees instead of full 360. They had to go through and carefully match the magnetron radar signal source because they used more than one guidance boat to extend the range, use the full range of Regulus. That turned out to be quite a chore too. So the last component for launch on ship was the launcher itself. This is the first one on the right. Let me get my cursor up there. So this is the desert launcher, and you can see casters right here. This thing was a behemoth. It was built to launch the missile with the lower tail fin. But this thing was very hard to maneuver and quite a beast and very heavy. But it was the first launcher. It's called the desert launcher. And here the Regulus is on a dolly getting ready to be guided up onto the launch rails. This is on the Norton Sound. This is the Short Rail Mark II launcher. This is the display at the National Air and Space Museum. There's a bit of a story behind this, if I can toot my own horn. They asked me to come out to identify a strange container they had out at Silver Springs, and it turned out to be a transit container, the name Chance Vaught gave to the container for moving the missiles across country. Next to it, my host at the museum said, "Do you have any idea what this is?" And I looked down at the nameplate, and it was a Short Rail Mark II. So I said, "If you guys are going to display this, would you just do the missile the courtesy of not hanging it from the ceiling, but displaying it on this launcher?" So many years later, I came to look, and sure enough, there it was. My dad, who had been very skeptical about how long it took for me to write the book, came to the museum one time, apparently, according to him, saw the missile on display, and like any proud father, told the tour guide that his son had written a comprehensive history of the missile. And the guide apparently looked at him like, "Yeah, so what?" But I was particularly pleased to see the missile in such beautiful shape. Okay, we talked about two of the three launchers. But those two launchers were needed to launch the zero-length launcher using the boost JATO bottles. So the JATO bottles had to be ejected by air pressure. Here's one, here's the other. They had to be aligned, and the key was aligning to the center of gravity of the missile. And that's what this little target is. It's the center of gravity, indicating the center of gravity of the missile. So they used bore sight apparatus like you would use on a gun barrel to line up the JATO bottles. These four items are the launch slippers, and you can see them engaged in the rails. I'm not an engineer, so it seems very strange to me that four such slender pieces of metal could support the missile and guide it on the launch rails. The missile weighed about 14,000 pounds. Okay, the last way of launching well, not the last, but the non-booster version was called a star cart, steam-assisted Regulus. This took advantage of the steam catapult system for launching the aircraft. And Regulus on board a carrier was difficult for the Airedales to enjoy having on board because it took up so much room and made such a mess of the launch operations for the aircraft. So by having this star cart, they could do away with the enormous desert launcher or other launchers and not take up extra space. So the missile would fly off the end of the carrier, the star cart would drop off and into the water, and the missile would go ahead and fly. The first launch off a ship was the Norton Sound with using the desert launcher. And this was on 3 November 1952. Then the spectacular launch from a warship was off the Princeton in 16 December 1952. Here's the view with ignition, looking over the 5-inch guns. And then this view coming up is the iconic view you see a lot when they talk about Regulus and aircraft carriers. Note that the island is completely free of smoke. We'll see in just a minute how that didn't happen on another launch. The first launch from a submarine was on 15 July 1953. It was the 58th launch of the missile, and it was very successful. I like this photograph because it was given to me by the gentleman on the left. He's Jack Welch. Jack Welch was a missile operations engineer. Chance Vought assigned an MOE, a missile operations engineer, to each of the missiles as the babysitter and the person that the Navy would call if they needed parts or something fixed. So he's standing there on the left. The reason I mention that is he became the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Acquisition. And I made an appointment to see him. And I get into the Pentagon, which I'm not sure how many of you have been in the Pentagon, but I was there once and it was pretty awe-inspiring. So I finally find the office and I show up, and his aide in the front asks who I am, and I tell him, and he kind of looks me up and down like, I'm not sure what you're doing here. And Jack Welch came out of his office and practically gave me a bear hug and said, come on and sit down, let's talk Regulus. And he gave me a copy of this photograph. Okay, here's what the launch looked like.
Head to a target hundreds of miles away.
So tactical operations, Regulus 1 flew at Mach 0.85 at 35,000 feet cruise altitude. Trounce submarine guidance. Trounce guidance was used with submarines and cruisers. It had a 230 nautical mile range with a single ship because that was the horizon distance from 35,000. Well, that's not quite true. But if you wanted to get the full 500 nautical miles, you needed a second guidance submarine, then you could get the full range. Regulus assault mission was something that Chance Vaught dreamed up and was actually used with submarines, carriers, and cruisers. This is where the carrier would launch the equivalent of the TB-2D, except it was armed. And they had the guidance, a single pilot guided the missile as well as flew the aircraft. They didn't have to worry about landing and stuff. They just had to worry about direction and altitude. So once they got to the target, they're using radio command control. The aircraft would break off and at a safe distance detonate the warhead. This sounds kind of Rube Goldberg, to put it mildly, but I talked with several of the pilots that practiced this for the Navy, and they said they had photographic evidence that they were actually pretty good at getting the missile on target. And the ram was an alternative way to use the entire range of Regulus 1. Accuracy, 0.5 nautical miles CEP. That's still pretty good, especially for something that carried a W5, which was a derivative of the Mark V gravity bomb, and had a yield of between 40 to 50 kilotons. The other weapon they carried was the W27, which is a derivative of the Mark 27 gravity bomb with a yield of 1.9 megatons. So with any of these warhead yields, 0.5 nautical miles was, as they say, close enough in horseshoes and hand grenades in nuclear war. So we talked about deployment. Aircraft carrier deployment between 1955 and 1964. The aircraft carriers didn't deploy that long. They just each did one deployment to Westpac and one to the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. Interestingly enough, the Randolph was off the coast of Egypt when they had the Suez Canal crisis back in the 50s. Heavy cruisers. The Los Angeles did 8 deployments. Helena did 3. Toledo did 4. And the Macon did 3. Now we come to the submarines, which is really what Regulus was built for. So all this other, the carrier and the cruiser were things that Chance Vaught came up with and the Navy bought off on and used. The submarines, the Tunny, 8 deployments. Barbaro, 8. Grayback, 9. Her sister ship, the Growler, 8. And Halibut, 7. So this wasn't a trivial program. So this is the only launch I could find off the Randolph. I couldn't find one off the Hancock, although I have some really beautiful color slides from it. That's actually another interesting story. I talked to a rear admiral who was retired. I don't remember his name right now, but he was involved with the Hancock. And he said, you know, George Monthan was one of the guidance pilots, RAM pilots, and he lives in Tucson, which is where I live. So I thought, oh boy, I'm going to have a nice, inexpensive interview. I won't have to fly or drive anywhere. So I get in the car and I drive over to see George. Very nice guy, looked very much like Gregory Peck. And one of his relatives was the Monthan that Davis Monthan Air Force Base was named after. So I get there and I park as I was taught by my parents, not park in the driveway, park on the street. And I get in and I'm talking to George and we're having a good time. And his wife comes in and goes, David, I'm so sorry. I backed into your car. And I thought, oh Christ, there goes my inexpensive interview. Turned out her Mercedes had exactly the same bumper height as I can't remember the brand of car, but the same bumper height as mine. So she backed into my car, but didn't cause any damage. This is a bulge nose missile on the back of on the stern of the USS Los Angeles on a ceremony before her last patrol. The reason I call it bulge is this missile didn't have a symmetrical nose. It could carry either the Mark V or the Mark 27. The seaplane hangar was converted to carry 3 Regulus missiles. This is the layout. 2 missiles were stored on the starboard side, one above the other, and the third was on the handling dolly. Originally, the cruisers were configured to launch just for the RAM program, but they were converted to Trounce as well later in the program. That would give them 120 some mile range. This is a missile being brought up to the surface on the handling dolly elevator. Not much in the way of clearance. Then this one shows the missile and is about ready to be picked up and hung from the ceiling. And then the missile on the handling dolly to the right would be slid underneath.
In October 1959, the Navy moved the Regulus submarines to Pearl Harbor to begin a series of deterrent patrols. Their new mission? To maintain peace through the threat of mutual assured destruction. The Regulus deterrent patrols represented a whole new era in the history of the submarine Navy. No one had any idea if it would work or what would be involved. The only thing that was certain was that the Pentagon hoped to keep 4 Regulus missiles off the coast of the Soviet Union, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year.
The entire program was so highly classified. It was all top secret code word operations. No one in Pearl Harbor knew what we were doing.
From their home base in Hawaii, Regulus boats would transit the northern Pacific, stop briefly at Adak, Alaska, or Midway Island if they needed to refuel, and then move to a patrol zone in the stormy waters off the Kamchatka Peninsula.
So I couldn't find much in the way of photographic evidence, obviously, of the patrols, but I have a few interesting slides from the patrols. The Tunny was caught on the surface by a P-2V patrol aircraft on 24 August 1960. These were aircraft that were searching for Soviet submarines, but the American submarines were not to be caught on surface. So here she is on surface enjoying a brief respite from being submerged. And apparently the lookouts didn't catch this P-2V. So the pilots took great pleasure in presenting this photograph to the officer of the watch, and I'm not recalling his name right now. This is a broken arrow nuclear event. Barbera was returning to Norfolk from Operation Strike Back, a exercise off of Norway, using a bunch of NATO vessels as well as a Barbero. So they were in the middle of the ocean and the captain decided, even though the weather wasn't very good, conduct a battle stations missile drill with a tactical missile. So this missile had a nuclear warhead on it. Near the end of the drill, with the missile engine on idle, the launcher was lowered in preparation for stowing the missile into the hangar. It was on idle to cool the engine down before they stored it. A wave hit the submarine in just the right way that the missile glided out the front of the launcher, which had no stops, and now is resting with its wings across the railing off the launcher, something they didn't really expect would ever happen on a submarine. Everything was okay. They got everything back, but it turned out later that the captain didn't do so well in his next career move. This is a general arrangement of the Tunny. What they did is they took the Gato World War II diesel submarine. They put a hatch. Let me get my cursor over here. They put an access hatch here so that you could get in and out of the hangar while she was submerged. They ended up using that as a troop carrier during the Vietnam War. Okay, the next boat I'm going to show you is the Grayback. Excuse me, the Growler. The Growler and the Grayback were two of a kind. This shows the missile off to the starboard side getting ready to be launched. We have a better view of it was quite a weird shaped submarine because it was originally built to handle the two Regulus II missiles, which were considerably longer. The Grayback could handle and Growler could each patrol with 4 Regulus I missiles. So either one patrol would have strategic deterrent patrol, would have the Barbero and the Tunny, each carrying 2 missiles on patrol at the same time. Then after they were relieved, they'd be relieved by either the Growler, the Grayback, or the Halibut. The Growler and Grayback each carried 4 missiles and the Halibut carried 5. So at no time over the period of the strategic deterrent patrols, which is from 1959 to 1964, there was always at least 4 missiles off the coast of Kamchatka and Petropavlovsk, the submarine base there. So now we come to the Halibut, the only nuclear-powered regular submarine. As I mentioned, it was originally designed to handle the Regulus II missile, which is considerably longer. So much to my joy, I found this image at the Maryland Naval Shipyard. This is the hangar section of the submarine on the left being transported. And then here it is being lowered into the King County. Here's the King County AG-157. It's kind of hard to see, but what they did is this is a test, a design evaluation for the Halibut. Before the Halibut was actually laid out, they put together this simulation of it with the hangar here, the launcher system, and this is a Regulus II missile sitting on the launcher. It's very close to the sail, and they had to paint the sail with special heat retardant paint because the exhaust from the JATO bottles and the engine during warm run-up was impinging directly on the sail. I tried to get a chance to get inside the Halibut. She was at Bremerton when she was retired, but they wouldn't let me on board due to all the stuff she did that was top secret, apparently. Halibut was involved in finding that Soviet submarine that sank in the late 60s and where they tried to recover part of it. So this is the model, quarter scale model of the hangar. If you've ever been in a submarine, this is cavernous compared to most of the submarine spaces. Here's the model as a 6-foot sailor. And you can see there were 4 Regulus I's and 1 on the launcher right here. The 5th one's missing right here. This could also hold 5 Regulus II missiles. This is the Halibut with her first launch in 25 March 1960. So you can see the difference in size between a Regulus II and a Regulus I. That was considerable. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about Regulus II, so we'll briefly talk about Regulus II now in terms of some images. Regulus II was thought of very early after they began the work with Regulus I. They knew they were going to need a supersonic version. It had 1,000 nautical mile range, twice that of Regulus I, cruising altitude of 41,000 feet, which wasn't that much higher than Regulus I. Cruising speed of Mach 2.0. So instead of Mach 0.85, 0.9, this was truly supersonic. And it had inertial navigation, so they didn't have to worry about a submarine staying on the surface. For a battle station's missile, from surfacing to launch took about 15 minutes. Now, a lot of critics said that was dumb and that was an exposure of the submarine, and Polaris was much better because it could launch underwater, which is all true, except all the Regulus one submariners I talked to said they felt 15 minutes in the event of a nuclear war. 15 minutes was more than enough time, and they weren't too worried about being discovered in that part of the ocean. This is the general layout of the Regulus 2. It also had they made a version of the fleet training missile with the wheels for taxi tests, etc. They used the J-65 engine initially and would have been deployed with the J-79, much more powerful. Here the air intake was right down here. So most of the gear didn't have the plenum in the air blowing over like in Regulus 1. It had a single JATO bottle. We'll get to it in just a minute. I want to show you a picture of it on the ground. It was really beautiful. I made a model of a Regulus 2 many, many years ago. And that's what led me to want to write a book about it. Between making a model and reading some not very nice comments by one of the leading naval historians back in the mid-1990s, I decided if this weapon system was virtually unknown and I would write a book about it. So as it turned out, one of my relatives on my wife's side, her husband was the first CO of the Grayback. So she knew a lot of people to introduce me to. Her husband passed away before I could interview him, but she introduced me to many of the officers that were on the Grayback with him. And that allowed me to write the book. One of the interesting pictures I came across was this shock and acoustical energy test. What they did was they took a short, instead of the 4 or 5 second launch burn time to launch Regulus 2, it took a 1.5 second booster, tied the missile down. They needed to see if the guidance system could handle the ignition and shock of the ignition and the acoustical energy generated by a JATO bottle. And it did without any problems. This is a typical launch of Regulus 2. And this has a little bit of history behind it as well. I was called one day by the historian at Edwards Air Force Base to see if I would mind driving out to identify some things on the base for them. Turned out they wanted to know what they had this particular deflector device sitting on the edge of the lake bed, and they didn't know what it was. So I came out and identified for them and showed them the picture and said that was the original launch site for Regulus 2. Years later, I got another phone call this time from the National Test Site. They had found some debris of an autograph covered missile. They wanted to know if I could help identify it. So on a one-day trip, I always wanted to go to the National Test Site. I flew out. I told them over the phone it was the GM 2020. And I knew that for a fact. I didn't need to go and look, but they wanted me to come out anyway. So I did. And the first piece of metal I picked up at the crash site said GM 2020 on it. So it was an interest. They had to identify all the crash sites at Edwards in case the helicopter pilots were flying over and saw the debris from the aircraft. They'd be able to say, no, we already know it's not a crashed aircraft we need to worry about. One of the more interesting tests that they did on Grayback were these mass launch sleds. This was a 7-ton, and then they also had a 13-ton for the Regulus 2. They went out to the Carquinez mudflats and launched with a booster, launched these mass sleds to make sure the launcher would operate properly. This is a TV camera that they originally thought would be great for watching the launches, but they had so much trouble with them flooding, they just turned them off. The hangar fairings are here. And then the launcher was turned and tucked into these two fittings. There's only one Regulus II launch off of the submarine. That was in September of 1958, 16 September 1958. Very successful launch. And a couple months later, they did another launch, this time off the King County, evaluating the halibut hangar and launcher. This was done on the 10th of December 1958. Very successful, and 2 days later, they canceled the Regulus II in favor of Polaris. Finally, we come to the two slides I thought would be interesting to show you. The one on the left is a single frame out of a 70 millimeter shot. The first Bulge-nose tactical missile flight was conducted on 28 June 1956 and was completely successful. During one of the flights, the phototheodolite tracking system recorded a heretofore unseen event outside of wind tunnels. Shock waves were recorded in one frame of the film of a terminal dive into the Atomic Energy Committee's Salton Sea test range. The other photograph is on the right. This is on 18 September 1956 at Naval Air Station Chincoteague. Lieutenant David Stumpf was control pilot. After completing the ram pass at 500 feet, he requested permission to make a low-level run along the runway during a Regulus I demonstration for the newly designated admirals. Permission was granted. This is in Chincoteague. Permission was granted, and he brought the missile down to 300 feet, 30 feet above ground, and went alongside at 250 knots. He said it was one of the thrills of his career as a pilot. Okay, summary. As I said earlier, it was an obvious choice to cancel Reg 2 in favor of Polaris. Nonetheless, 40 Regulus I submarine deterrent patrols off the east coast of the Soviet Union filled a hole in the target coverage through 1964 when Polaris finally made it to the Pacific Ocean. From 59 to 64, at least four Regulus boats, at least four Regulus missiles were on station in the vicinity of the naval base at Petra. Tunny and Barbero for a total of 4, Grayback or Growler for 4, and Halibut for 5. This was all but ignored until 1997 when veterans of the Regulus deterrent patrols were awarded the right to wear the deterrent patrol insignia. A friend of mine who was the captain of the Tunny during some of her deterrent patrols took a copy of my book, which was released in 1996. And at one of the launch ceremonies for one of the nuclear submarines, he went up to one of the admirals that was in active duty, handed him the book, and he said, "Don't you think it's about time the Regulus deterrent patrol sailors got recognized?" And apparently the admiral read the book and saw how much was done in the deterrent patrols. And according to Captain Blair, that was the reason one of the reasons they got the pin. So if I did nothing else, I got recognition for a bunch of sailors that had been all but ignored for 30 some years. So that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Questions?
Wow, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. I learned so much this evening because I knew nothing about this program. But I am going to kick off with one question. You mentioned that, the Regulus was replaced by the Polaris and that it was an obvious choice. Why was it an obvious choice?
Well, 16 Polaris missiles carried far more megatonnage and could cover 16 targets, whereas at best the Halibut could cover 5 if it could survive to launch all 5 missiles. And it launched underwater, so the detection of the submarine was much less probable. Although from what I learned about from the sailors during the deterrent patrols, they rarely saw anything very exciting up there. So it wasn't as if the Soviet Union was out patrolling constantly looking for them. But the underwater launch was I think one of the driving forces, plus 16 missiles versus at most 5.
Hmm.
And the range was much greater.
Okay. I have one other question, then I'll turn it over to others. Was the Regulus ever deployed in combat, or was this strictly deterrence?
The Marines, in all cases, they carried nuclear warheads, so they were in place during the Suez Canal crisis. The Randolph was off the coast of Egypt, so in that sense, maybe you could consider it as almost in combat. But no, they were never used with high explosives.
All right, great. Let's open it up for questions. Dan, I know you have your hand raised.
Yeah, David, I have 2 questions. With regards to the weapons, when they tested it, did they ever test it with conventional weapons? I'm assuming they didn't test it with nuclear weapons. And where were the weapons stored? I'm assuming it was internal.
Yeah, the warheads were stored on the missile, and they did do a test. That's film I've since lost. I think the guy who directed the film might still have it, but yes, they did remove the nuclear components, and on more than one occasion during CETO demonstrations, they would fly a RAM mission into the middle of the array of ships and detonate the conventional explosives minus the nuclear material. But those are demonstrations. There was some calls. I read one memo about possibly making them capable of dispensing biological weapons, but that never came to fruition. Thank God.
Oh, geez.
And on the last slide, that F-86 has 2 stores on it. Are they rockets? I was just wondering if they were prepared to shoot down the missile during test if something went wrong. I was just wondering what the stores were on the F-86.
Those
on
are
that
2
very
wing
last
tanks,
slide.
I believe.
What are they?
I think there were 2 wind tanks. Let me see if I can get back and take a
Okay.
look.
Did the test missiles have some type of destructive device on them in case something went wrong?
No, they would just be. No, that's a good point. The test missiles, they did have one crash in the foothills and off the coast off of Hawaii near Camp Smith, and everybody flying along, the RAM pilot flying along with it, just prayed to God he could get it to dump in the jungle. Usually the RAM pilots could get it to drop out of the sky.
Okay. I was just wondering what those stores were on the F-86, if you know.
Those look like 2 drop tanks to me, but I'm not yeah, there's one on either side. I think those are drop tanks.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, they had guns. Anybody else? John?
David, my name is John Handy. I've looked at the Regulus at the Esterhazy Center all the time. I work there, and I've wondered where exactly the warhead is. Could you go back to that schematic you had at the beginning and point out where the warhead is?
Sure.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for being a volunteer there. I volunteered at the Titan Missile Museum, but a dream of mine was to volunteer at okay, the warhead for Reg 2 would have been right here. They did a terminal dive that I have film of that I've since lost. They did a terminal dive of both Reg 1 and Reg 2, and the airframes disappeared into the desert, diving from 35,000 feet. They never even found debris. They just found powdered rock.
Can you show us on the Regulus 1 too?
Yeah, I'm backing it up.
All right. And David, your audio is going in and out a little bit, so I don't know if you need to be closer to your microphone or not.
Okay, I'll do that. My voice is kind of soft. The warhead was right. Well, I'll go ahead and get back to the schematic. Sorry it's taking so long.
All right. Yeah, I was stationed at Davis Mountain when I was a brand new second Louis, and I've been out to that missile museum. It's amazing. It looks just like it did back in the day.
Yeah, it's a unique museum. That's an interesting story. I was volunteering there, and one day a lady called and said she had submitted a grant to the Air Force to write about what it was like to live around the sites in Little Rock. And she came out and gave her a tour of the museum. And okay, the warhead was right in this area. That was a fuel tank for the drone, but it was right in this area here. The plenum went over the warhead and back, then descended back down into this area.
I'm not seeing your cursor, but do
Oh,
you
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
remember?
This was an extra fuel tank for drone use.
Yeah.
It would have been right in this area here.
So the air intake went beside it?
Went over the top.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why it's bulged. It went over the top easily for the Mark V. They had to put the bulge in to allow the cylindrical W-27 to fit. Anyway, so this lady calls and she comes and visits, and I took her out to lunch. I said, it'd really be a shame if you got the proposal and didn't at least write something about the missile itself. So about 3 months later, I volunteered to write it for her, and she said, well, I don't have any interest in writing the proposal, the grant at all. We got the grant for 70 grand. So I said, well, how about if I write the whole book for you? Can you assign it to me? And she was able to do that. So I kind of backed into a $70,000 grant to write the Titan II book. And I didn't say anything about the people living around it.
That's great.
But that was, so after I wrote that book, my wife said, if you're going to write another book, you got to get in advance. So after the Titan II book, many years later, I wrote a book on the Minuteman program. But I didn't have, I had received an inheritance from my mom, and I considered that to be an advance.
Well, thanks for
Anybody
sharing.
else? I know that's a lot of information, but I had 7 years worth of research data when I wrote the book. So trying to cull that down to 45 minutes was a bit of a task.
Well, it's certainly a labor of love with all three of these books that you've written over the years, and we're grateful for it. And I'm certainly thankful that you've been willing to speak to our group regarding these three programs.
It was my pleasure, my honor to do so. As you might be able to tell, I love this subject, and one of the frustrations I have with my neurological malady is writing's becoming more and more difficult. I was going to write a book on Peacekeeper, but was told that most of the Peacekeeper information has been destroyed because it was deactivated. So, do you know, any of you know the name of the replacement for Minuteman? Going to be called the Sentinel. I thought it should be Minuteman 4, but no one asked me.
It must have been.
Eleanor,
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
this is Chuck Phillips.
Hello.
Hi. I believe there was a Regulus at the Naval Air Development Center in the mid to late 50s. Can you confirm that?
It could have been full scale. You mean as on display?
No, it was a real missile. They wanted me to investigate a automatic landing system for aircraft carriers. So I took the 2-channel autopilot out of it and adapted it and proved to the Navy that it was very conceivable to aid in the automatic landing system, what they called ALS, for aircraft carriers for the Navy pilots.
I can't confirm or deny, but it sounds quite, I mean, Reg 2 is, you can't miss a Reg 2. So
I believe it was a 1. I don't think it was
Oh.
as sophisticated. I don't remember a pointed nose on it. I remembered the nose with the air intake right in the front.
Yeah, okay, that seems feasible. I can't confirm it.
Yeah, okay, well, I appreciate your talk. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your work on the landing system.
Thank you.
All
That
right.
was a very great presentation. Thank you, Dave.
Oh, my pleasure. It's like I said, the Regulus, the Forgotten Weapon. I named the book that instead of with the later titles, because if I saw a book called Regulus, the Forgotten Weapon, I'd pull that baby off the bookshelf right away.
Sure. I love seeing the early testing and how they did it.
Well, that's an interesting story. When I found Roy Pearson, actually, I cold called Chance Spot, which is now LTV, and I cold called the secretary, and she goes, "Well, I just happened to know the guy who's in charge of the Chance Spot Survivors Club to retirees." So she gave me his phone number, Bill Michelli. I called Bill Michelli out of nowhere, tell him what I want to do, and he invites me out. So I don't know this guy from Adam. I get off at the airport at Dallas. There's an older guy in sandals and striped shorts and a polka dot shirt, so he kind of stood out. And I said, "Bill Michelli," and he said, "David Stumpf," and we immediately became close friends, and he introduced me to Roy Pearson. Roy had just gotten out of the hospital for cancer surgery and intestinal cancer. I mean, just gotten out. So he was very excited to see me. His wife was hovering. He finally said, "Just leave us alone, dear, I'm fine." And we talked for hours. I felt terrible, but he said, "David, this is the best medicine I could ask for."
Yeah.
So he pulled out his flight log and we went through 500 Regulus One flights. And he had flight information from each of the flights that I annotated the book with. So just truly wonderful guy.
Yeah. Amazing. Well, I'm going to head off. Thank you for a great presentation. Thank you, Eleanor, for hosting it. And I'll catch up with you guys next time.
All right. Thank you.
Okay,
All right. Thanks. Bye.
So
bye-bye.
David, you're running out of missiles to talk about. What's your next missile on the list? If I know you mentioned about Peacekeeper not being able to move forward with that, but
Well, what I've done is I've written several articles for Quest, the Space Flight Journal,
yeah.
and I've written several articles for Air Power History. One of them was about the evolution of the reentry vehicles for Minuteman. One was about the missile suspension system, something that for Minuteman that always amazed me. And then the last one was that I'm still writing. It's about a little known enhancement to the security of the Minuteman launch facilities. But other than that, I'm reaching the point now with this neurological malady that it's writing is getting more and more tough. The Minuteman book was written completely with voice recognition software, as I can't type anymore. So if you're ever looking for voice recognition software, I highly recommend Dragon Speak.
Okay. That's good to know. I did have one other question, which I'm still kind of blown away by this launching it and then radio control, into the target. Was there ever concern regarding like radio jamming, by the enemy that would have, had some sort of catastrophic consequences with the missile guidance?
They were worried about jamming with Trounce, and Trounce was pretty unjammable, at least back in that day. That's an excellent question, Eleanor, that no one ever brought up, jamming the command control. I never came across anything about that. They must have done something, because that's obviously would have been an obvious, easy thing for the Soviets to do, with my limited electronic knowledge.
Okay. Any other questions or comments? A lot of accolades and thank yous on chat, David. So I think this was a winner this evening.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the opportunity. And thank you everybody who listened. I hope you learned something new and enjoyed the talk.
Yeah, I thought it was great. So thanks again. And again, for the folks still on the line, please join us in May for John Schell, who's the guest speaker. He's a docent at the Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, and he's going to be speaking on research that he's conducted with some new insights regarding the shoot down of the U-2 with Francis Gary Powers in the early 60s. So
What date's that going to be, Eleanor?
I'm sorry?
What date is that going to be?
That will be the second Thursday of May, which I think, give me just a second. That will be May
12th?
May 12th.
Okay, great.
So,
Great. Okay. Thank you very much.
all right. Well, thanks everyone.
Mhm.
And thanks for listening this evening, and look forward to seeing everyone again next month.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right. Thank you all.